Hey, how are you? This is John. Thanks for joining me for this next Patreon exclusive video series. In this one, I'm going to be building Bandai's Shoretrooper. I'm really excited about this kit because it'll be the first really pure figure that I've built, large figure, you know, not the little Warhammer minis. So I'm looking forward to this one. And believe it or not, I only recently saw the movie that this character appears in, Rogue One. Yeah, I know, it's been out for a couple of years, and you know, you're probably thinking, how could you have just seen it? I'm kind of behind the times. But this appeals to me because it's not just the regular stormtrooper in the all-white armor. There's a lot of things going on with this figure, so I'm really excited about it. Now, I've already pulled all the parts out of the wrapper so we don't have to hear the crinkly paper. But as you'd expect with Bandai, the casting of the parts is just really nice. Lots of detail. Look at the fine detail on this little grill here, or whatever this is. The other parts, I mean, just gorgeous stuff. And this is, as is most of their models, if not all of them, it's snap fit. So, you know, we can do an advanced build of this, or you can give this to your 10-year-old nephew or niece, and they can put it together. So it's a really versatile kit. I'm just going to go through the parts here briefly, just so you can see what it's like. There's the classic Star Wars blaster, and he's got a rifle there. Check out the detail on the rifle parts. That looks so good. It's got various hands for holding the gun and for, you know, doing the jazz hands thing, and just some really good stuff in here. Looks like they've got a small base for the figure to stand on. There's these are polycaps. This is the flexible plastic for the various joints and things like that. This is what makes the articulation possible. I'm kind of mixed on polycaps. I mean, if you want articulation, I'm glad that they're there, and they make assembly of things sometimes fairly easy. But at the same time, I wish that if I wanted to do a fixed figure, I wish these would actually accept some kind of glue. I haven't found a glue yet that works on them. This is the cloth part of the figure's sections, the various joints. It's got, the plastic is smooth, but it has, of course, wrinkles in it to represent cloth. I think in this scale that's appropriate. Look at the tread on the boots there. That's really nice. I like that. The kit comes with both stickers, which we can throw those away, and water slide decals. Bandai's water slide decals are pretty good. They're not quite what I'm used to in terms of, you know, from the aircraft world of using cartograph or something like that. I plan to paint most of this rather than use the decals. At least that's my plan now as I'm looking at the parts. But these are very, very usable, very good decals. It has this, one of the versions has this skirt around it, and it comes with this very thin piece of cloth. I never have been a real fan of using actual cloth on models because I just think it always looks a little out of scale. But we'll see. I may end up using that. And then one piece had already come loose, so that's sitting in the box. The instructions are fairly simple. Starts with the construction of the head, and if you've never built a Bandai kit, they use, pay attention to the symbols. They tell you how to orient things. These little red symbols here indicate, you know, that this goes up this way and this needs to be forward. Pay attention to those because it really matters when you're doing that. Sometimes they'll even give you some information about, you know, it goes in this order, you know, do this thing first, do this thing second. But then you get into the proper instructions here. I love this. It'll even tell you sometimes right there, you know, you should hear a snap. So they're very clear, even though they're pretty much only using symbology. And then here you get the layout of the decals and you know, some painting guide and things like that. So that'll come into play later. My plan is to build each of the separate components and then, as much as possible, airbrush the base colors and then brush paint anything additional. That's my plan right now. As I get further into assembling it, I may find that I need to adjust that depending on the seam lines and you know, other things like that. But that's my basic plan going into this. Here's a point of construction I want to bring up because when building just about any band, this can work for any kit, I guess, but especially Bandai kits because of their snap fit nature. There's this piece here, A7, where his visor is. It's clear. It's a smoky clear part. Now, I could just paint that black, but I kind of like the smoky look, especially if I can give some kind of color in here that will let something shine through. So what I need to see, because the instructions would have you go ahead and assemble this ahead of time, and yeah, I could mask it, but what I want to see is, can I leave this off and put this together? Because there's going to be a seam line on the back of the head, and I'm going to need to do some sanding to correct that. So I want to be able to potentially take this apart for test fitting to make sure it all works. Now, Bandai fit is really tight. So if you just push this thing together, you may not get it apart without damaging it. So what I do is I get my low grade nippers, and you see there's two pegs, one here and one here. One is a more traditional peg, the other one's a hollow peg. For the traditional, just the solid pegs, I clip them off at about a 45-degree angle so that there will be something there for the other side to grip onto, but it won't be so much that I can't pull it out later. Now, if I try to cut this at a 45-degree angle, this hollow one, it's likely to deform and won't be round anymore. So what I do is, instead of cutting that peg, I go to the corresponding hole on the other side and I clip it in a couple of places. And what that does is it removes the tension from that so that I can assemble and disassemble it easy. Now, this part here will fit in here, and that's going to be a pretty tight fit, but if that's the only thing I'm having to deal with, then the rest of it should be okay. Now what I'll do is, just to make sure, I can still pull it apart. And even when you clip it, you may get a little resistance, but trust me, this is going to be much easier. See, I can pull that apart if things go a little loppy-jawed on me. So I'll put that partially together, and what I want to see is, can I take this part, get it oriented right, and slide it in there? And the answer is yes. I can get that in there. So now I know, let me pop that out. Now I know that I can leave that off and push this part fully together like that. And now I can glue this and sand away that line and get rid of that seam, and then towards the end of the build, I'll just slide this piece right in there, and I won't have to worry about masking it. These other black parts I can paint by hand. I don't mind if I overpaint those. Those will be easy to do. But that's just about any Bandai kit. Taking that approach of clipping the pegs will allow you to be able to disassemble things if you need to, so that you can do a lot of test fitting and see what's going to work and what's not going to work. Okay, one other observation that just came to mind. Now that I've got this together, you see that there's a seam line right there. Now I'll glue that, I'll squeeze it together, and it'll make a little weld bead that I can sand off and it'll look okay. If you don't want to have to do that, you can grab a scribing tool and scribe in where that joint is. And what you're going to want to do is make it about the width. You see the top of his helmet? See those panel lines that are already built in? You're going to want it to look about like that. So you can scribe that in. This will be on any kit, but specifically here, you could scribe that in. It'll look like a panel line, and it'll look perfectly fine. So there's a lot of options for dealing with panel lines on these kits. Okay, I have the Shoretrooper's head built, and you can see it's pretty much looking like a Shoretrooper's head. I'll go back in later and fill in that seam line, let the glue dry, and see how much of a bead I can get out of it. What I do when I glue that together is I'll put in a fairly good amount of glue initially and squeeze it together, and then I'll wait 4 or 5 minutes and go in and do some additional squeezing and maybe adding in a little more glue just to get as much of that plastic out of there as I can. Sometimes you can get enough that all you got to do is scrape the bead off and you're good to go. Other times it may require a little bit of filler if you really want to clean it up. But I've got his head and his visor, and that section is ready to go. And as Bandai says here, check, I'm done. So I'll move on to the other parts, and I'm not going to show everything. Along the way as I'm building it, if I find something that I think would be useful in terms of build strategy, build planning, I'll show that, but otherwise I'm just going to go on through and get this guy snapped up and ready for painting. All right, I've got a few things I want to show that are just general construction notes that if you build this kit will hopefully be helpful. The thigh pieces, this is supposed to be fabric, and there's no real good way to hide the seam lines with this. So the way I handle these, first I get the poly cap in place, don't forget that. And I go ahead and snap the part together and get it mostly tightened down, but not entirely. Like that, so there's still just a little bit of a gap. And then what I do is I grab my handy Tamiya extra thin cement and I just let some glue run along this joint. And I'm not dainty with the glue. When I glue stuff, I glue stuff. I think glued stuff ought to stay together. So I go in here and I get that glued up. And I finish squeezing it together. Yeah, you hear that good pop there, you know it's together. And I squeeze it really hard. I'm not playing around with that squeeze. And what happens, that part up there doesn't have an alignment pin, so you have to be careful that it doesn't push past itself, I guess I should say. But I squeeze that together like that, which builds up a little bead of glue. Now I'll set this aside and I'll do it again in 5 minutes. Repeat that, add another little bit of glue and squeeze it together to make sure I've got a good join. But once you let this dry for 24 hours, it'll be easy to sand away. Okay, I have the other leg that's already glued and allowed to dry. I let this dry overnight. That should be enough. If you can give it 24 hours, that's probably a little better, but I gave it overnight. But you can see that it's just pulled up a little bead there that you can then shave off. Now, you could sand it off, but in sanding, you might lose some of the detail because that's a lot to sand down. So what I do is I go in and I gently scrape. I start off doing it that way, just the barest amount of pressure to look for any large ridges or anything like that to shave it off. And then once I get it down to where there's no major ridges, I use the back of my knife, or the blade of my knife, but at a 45-degree angle, and I just start scraping it like that. What's happening here is it's planing, I guess you'd say planing down the join, and you're getting it to the plastic where it's melted together, because the Tamiya extra thin cement is a bonding cement. It melts the plastic fairly thoroughly. I don't recommend, there's other bonding cements. I don't recommend using things like tube glue or any of those others that aren't really bonding cements. But you go through and you scrape this off like this. Once you get it planed down fairly nice, I like to use my thumbnail to just rub over it to see if I missed anything. An easy way to tell when you're sanding anything, if you've got everything sanded down, is it will appear dull. If you see glossy spots popping up, then that's where you still need to work. Now, once I've got it down like that, I'm going to get a sanding stick. This is a 320 grit, but you can use, you could use 400, you could use 600, whatever works. The trick is I'm going to dip it in water. I just dipped the whole tip in water. And I'm going to come back here and I'm going to start sanding this using circular motions like that. I'm not pushing hard. I'm being fairly gentle with it. And every now and then I'll just push the water off and look and see how it is coming along. All right, once I'm done, you can see that it's pretty good. It'll stand up under paint, and I didn't ruin a lot of the fabric texture by heavy sanding and things like that. So that little method of planing things down can work really well on areas where you don't want to get a lot of damage. And I didn't do any refinement with any further sanding sticks. A wet sanding stick, even if it's a lower grit, works much better in my opinion than if I were to sit here and use a 240, then a 320, then a 600, and then 1000 dry. A 320 wet gets it perfectly smooth for the purposes of painting. On some of the pieces, Bandai's done a great job of putting the seam next to a ridged part. I don't know if you can notice, I don't know if you can see that, but there's like this little ridge right here. And the join is right next to that. So you can glue this down and squeeze it just a little, not enough to push up a bead, and it'll hold everything together, seal up any minor cracks, and you won't have to do any kind of treatment of that seam. The key to this though is make sure that the mating surfaces are really smooth. Hold them up to the light, make sure there's no casting imperfections along there. And if there are, use the X-Acto knife like I just showed in the previous segment to kind of plane those down gently. Bandai's tolerances are so tight that the least little bump will give some kind of just the tiniest gap. But if you really pay attention to those, you can mitigate them ahead of time, squeeze the parts together, and they virtually look like it's been cast as a single piece. Another thing I wanted to point out, Bandai uses various symbols, as I mentioned earlier in the video, to show the order, the sequence, or orientation. One of the things they do is they use these little triangles, and I'm going to hold this right up to the camera, and I highlighted those so you can clearly see. They use those little triangles to indicate where they've done undergating. Undergating is where, say this is a part, and this is the edge, and here's the part itself. Normally the sprue gate connects like that, and so you trim it off and you have to trim it down there, and you may or may not get some stressing along the edge there. You have to clean that up. But sometimes if this edge here can be difficult to clean up, they'll put the gate on so that it connects like that, in that kind of fashion, so that when you cut it off, you're actually cleaning up this surface, not this one, and this one remains very clean. Now they've done that, and I want to show this. They've done that on this small part, which is part of the arm. It's part of the, I think it's the elbow joint. And you'll notice I left the undergates sticking out there so that you could see those. From the top, they look like normal gates, but when you, and I don't even know if this will come out on camera because the part's so small, but they're actually connected along, not along the side, but along the bottom edge. Now, to clean those up, all I do, and this is going to be a little difficult because I'm having to get in here close with my handy dandy Optivisor to be able to see what I'm doing, but I use my fine cutters and I trim that down, trying to be parallel to the edge like that. Sometimes you get a little bit that's left, but that's okay. And then once I get that cleaned down, and normally I'm not this ham-fisted at it because trying to do it with the camera between me and the work is a little difficult, but I just shave that back because you really want this to be a good clean join. So I'll have to finish cleaning this up off camera because it's just about impossible to see what I'm doing this with the thing in the way. But what it does, you'll notice there's a grooved surface along here. And by not having the join or the sprue gate on the outside of that, it preserves that detail. And you're dealing with not, pardon the bump of the camera there, you're not dealing with the edge here, but you're dealing with this flat surface on this side. So if you clean that up good, you'll get a good join and there won't be any kind of loss of detail on the edge of the part. All right, just another little brief construction note. I'm going to be airbrushing the base colors on. So I'm going to leave the components broken down into various parts, which I'll show in a little bit later on in the video. One of the things I wanted to show is sometimes you can use the parts of the model to hold pieces for painting. Like this hand armor here is a fairly tiny part, and you know, that can be hard to get up on an alligator clip. It's easy to lose. So sometimes what I'll do is I'll leave it, I put it on the hand here so I can clip the hand, and the first color I'm going to paint is this cream color. So I'll paint that, and when it's completely painted, and because I'll be using lacquers, it'll dry really fast. Once it's dry, I'll just pop that off, set it aside, paint that black, and I can then bring the two back together. No crazy masking, no brush painting, nothing going on like that. But because I use the hand as the holder for the armor, it speeds things up and keeps me from losing parts. Another construction note I wanted to point out, I've got this left leg partially assembled. Well, I think it's the right leg with the left foot, but anyway, it demonstrates it fine. If you're going to leave it articulated, there's going to be some odd gaps and transitions between the thigh part, the knee part, and the ankle. You know, you see the ankle, it's got that little circle there. That's necessary so that it can move. Same way with the knee, that weird just kind of overhang of the pants. It's got to be there for the knee to move. If you were going to build this in a fixed position, this is me just saying I think you could do this because I'm not trying this because I'm going to leave it so that it can move. But I think what you could do is you could fill this with some putty. It would take a little work, but fill it with some putty. Shape the putty to put in the appropriate, you know, wrinkles and things like that, and then smooth this transition down, and you could get a much better look to the model than having it articulated. I wish they had extra parts in it that had just a fixed pose so that it looked a little more natural, because these are a bit poofy, and then it goes down to this, and I mean, with these little skinny ankles, it's going real fast into MC Hammer look. So, you know, hammer time. But anyway, just an observation on making the leg look a little more natural if you're going to go for a fixed pose. Okay, I have all the parts assembled and ready for painting. It looks like quite a bit, but it's actually going to snap up really quick because I wanted to break it down by color. So you've got things like, here's his neck, the shoulder joint, the elbow joint, hip, knees, thigh, calf, so forth. So it'll paint up really, really easily and snap together at the end without very much problem. I didn't build the torso. I would have built the upper torso as one unit and just hand painted it black, but there's some little details. I'll try and get that to show on camera. There's some little details just right here that I think would look better if they were painted and a little dry brushing and just a little bit of treatment to them. And they go right inside here, but they're recessed enough that I didn't feel like I could get right in there without creating some complications. So I kept those separate. I felt this part here, his waist, that there's enough separation between the black part and the white part that I'll just paint this whole thing white and then brush paint that black, and it should work fairly well. A few of the other things I assembled, like these joints, those polycaps, doesn't matter what color they are. I'm thinking I'm going to paint the inside of the armor maybe a gray color, just to offset it, just to give it some offset a little bit so that it doesn't look so shiny. I think it would just look weird that way. But this is how I've got it in the construction phase, I guess you'd say, ready for paint. And I think I'm going to go ahead and end the video here. It's getting up to about the half-hour mark, based on the number of segments I've filmed. So I think if you're building the kit, and I do urge you to build one of these Bandai figures, especially this one if you like it. I think it's really cool looking. I think this gives you some good information to help get the project along and come up with a fairly logical sequence. So, and I don't know that it would do much good to go paint the parts and then come back and say, well, here they are painted and they're going to be the exact same color as this. So I'll stop it here. But the next video will cover obviously the base painting and then detail painting, and depending on how much time that takes, may get into the weathering. That may go into a third segment. I'll just have to see as I film it. So with all that rambling on done, thank you so much for watching this video, and thank you so much for being a patron. I really appreciate it. It means a lot to me and to my family. So again, thank you for that. And with all that being said, happy day to you, friends. Bye-bye.